In this video, I'll talk about one of the most difficult puzzles that must be solved in order to mitigate climate change. Should nuclear power be part of that mitigation? I'll focus on safety by reviewing what we know about the accident at Chernobyl. The former Soviet Union built the Chernobyl nuclear power plant about 100 kilometers from Kyiv, capital of Ukraine. By 1986, 4 reactors were operating, and reactors 5 and 6 were under construction. Pripyat, a new city of 50,000, was home to workers and their families. On the night of April 25-26, 1986, the crew operating Reactor 4 conducted an ill-advised test of the reactor's emergency control equipment. They made a series of mistakes that created a rapid spike in power output and blew the reactor to pieces. The graphite core caught fire and burned for 10 days. Massive amounts of radioactive debris fell over Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and Europe. Ultimately, the accident contaminated most of the northern hemisphere. Very well, but what connects climate change and Chernobyl? A simple logic makes the link. Carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, has caused most climate change. A nuclear reactor emits very little carbon dioxide. Therefore, nuclear power is a good way to reduce the emissions and protect climate. The Chernobyl accident, however, has caused serious health effects in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Scientific projections also indicate significant health effects have occurred and will continue in the rest of Europe. Thus the question, does the Chernobyl accident suggest that nuclear power is too dangerous and thus not useful for mitigating climate change? The explosions of the nuclear power plants at Fukushima, Japan in 2011 reinforced these concerns. Too dangerous suggests the answer has ethical, political, and economic meanings. Science can help, but science alone will not provide an answer. In the remainder of this talk, I'll focus on scientific studies on the health effects of Chernobyl. They provide information upon which people can judge if the consequences were too high. Let's compare the 3 most recent efforts to estimate health effects. First, Chernobyl Forum, a scientific study organized by the United Nations, sought authoritative, consensual findings. It began in 2002. Chernobyl Forum released 4 documents between 2005 and 2008, but it did not succeed in establishing a consensus. Its non-technical summaries in 2005 did not even completely reflect the findings of some of the scientists involved in the effort. Here are the highlights of the Chernobyl Forum. The Forum's press release in 2005 claimed to provide definitive answers about the dangers from radiation from Chernobyl and conveyed a sense of scientific consensus by noting that more than 100 scientists had been involved. This press release was probably the most frequently cited Chernobyl Forum document. It noted, fewer than 50 deaths were so far directly attributable to the accident. Up to 4,000 deaths may occur among the most highly exposed. 2,200 of these deaths will be among the 200,000 emergency workers. About 4,000 cases of thyroid cancer had resulted, with 9 deaths. Survival of thyroid cancers at nearly 99% in Belarus. No evidence of increased leukemia in affected populations. And the accident was serious, but profound health effects had not occurred. The press release stated that impacts of Chernobyl were not as large as originally feared and reassured that in most cases radiation had returned to acceptable levels. Health problems in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine stemmed more from social and economic factors than radiation. Other publications from Chernobyl Forum included detailed scientific statements which presented health impacts different from the press release. Where the press release announced up to 4,000 deaths from cancer, the detailed statements projected between 9,000 and 10,000 cancer deaths. How can this figure reconcile with the lower ones? The 4,000 figure probably counts only projected cancer deaths among emergency workers in 1986-87, evacuees from the most severely affected zone around the nuclear power plant, and residents of the most severely impacted areas who were not evacuated. The additional 5,000 to 6,000 deaths in the higher estimates would occur among the 6.8 million people living outside the most severely impacted areas. It's also important to note that Chernobyl Forum relied upon epidemiological surveys with careful individual dose reconstructions. Such studies are expensive and time-consuming, but they produce results with the lowest levels possible of uncertainty. In opposition to Chernobyl Forum, Ian Fairley and David Sumner prepared a report, The Other Report on Chernobyl, or TORCH, for the Greens in the European Parliament. TORCH criticized the methods employed by Chernobyl Forum and concluded the cancer mortality caused by radiation from Chernobyl over all of Europe is likely to lie between 30,000 and 60,000 deaths. The details and assumptions of TORCH explain the major differences, each of which supported an increase in the estimate of mortalities. TORCH estimated exposures for all of Europe rather than just Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. TORCH accepted an earlier estimate of the collective dose from Chernobyl radiation for the entire world of 600,000 person-sieverts, and Chernobyl Forum confined its estimate to 55,000 person-sieverts for Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And TORCH argued that atomic bomb tests had left contamination of Europe at up to 4 kilobecquerels per square meter, and therefore concluded that areas with over 4 kilobecquerels per square meter were contaminated by Chernobyl. Chernobyl Forum confined its estimates to areas with at least 40 kilobecquerels per square meter. 3 scientists from Belarus and Russia also issued a rebuttal to Chernobyl Forum. It was called Chernobyl Consequences of the Catastrophe for People and the Environment, or Consequences, and was published by the New York Academy of Sciences in 2009. It summarized the findings of a vast literature in Slavic languages that the authors believed had been ignored by Chernobyl Forum. It is book-length, 327 pages, and rivals Chernobyl Forum in depth. Similar to the TORCH report, however, it represents the work of just 3 scientists rather than over 100. Consequences reads like an extended annotated bibliography based on about 1,000 titles reflecting over 5,000 publications, but does little to reconcile differences among them or offer critical analysis of which studies have higher or lower credibility or significance. On the other hand, Consequences argues that Chernobyl Forum mistakenly either ignored an extensive literature of in Slavic languages, or ruled it as not informative because of lack of proper scientific protocols. The following items represent the major differences between Consequences and Chernobyl Forum. Consequences cites epidemiological surveys and risk models to conclude that the Chernobyl accident has resulted in or will result in 44,040 cancer mortalities in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, and ultimately an excess of over 475,000 cancer deaths worldwide. These numbers are significantly higher than Chernobyl Forum. Consequences, like TORCH, considers the entire world, not just all Europe, nor just Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Consequences uses epidemiological surveys that are ecological in nature. Chernobyl Forum relied only on surveys with individual dose reconstructions, a standard that produces results with less uncertainty. Consequences argues that cancer may not comprise the majority of health effects, a stance that differs from that found in Torch and Chernobyl Forum. Consequences, like Torch, argued that Chernobyl Forum estimated the impacts only from lands contaminated at 40 kilobecquerels per square meter or more, and ignored impacts from lands less contaminated. And finally, Consequences argued that radionuclides other than just 137 cesium and 131 iodine had impacts, and that Chernobyl Forum underplayed the effects of hot particles that created intense contamination in specific areas. On an important philosophical point, Consequences acknowledges that many of the studies in the former USSR, especially those prepared immediately after the accident and into the 1990s, had poor financial support and had to contend with governmental authorities who, the authors argue, hindered the collection of high-quality data and led to underestimates of the health impacts. They implicitly acknowledge the lower statistical significance and higher uncertainty associated with conclusions drawn from this data. They counter this weakness, however, by noting that study after study showed comparable conclusions, and thus collectively these studies, whatever their individual methodological shortcomings, should be recognized as containing useful, important information. It's not surprising that the estimates of morbidity and mortality differ so much among these three studies, because the beginning assumptions are so different. Beyond assumptions, however, two additional factors yield sharp differences in estimates of health impacts: purpose of the study and tolerance of uncertainty. Chernobyl Forum was to help Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine recover from both Chernobyl and the economic disruptions caused by the breakup of the USSR. The latter led to sharp declines in economic activity and employment, which also caused health problems. Managing the Chernobyl catastrophe constrained the budgets of each country. Chernobyl Forum sought to estimate the health effects of Chernobyl and help those countries design effective, cost-efficient public health programs. From this perspective, it may have been justified to insist upon high standards of proof that a health problem existed. Torch and Consequences had a different mission. They each wanted to know the health impacts on all of Europe and on the entire world, respectively. Moreover, they sought to include all evidence of effects, even if substantial uncertainty surrounded the identification of these effects. Put differently, these two reports worried more about failure to identify a possible effect than about being absolutely certain of any effect identified. With this information, let's return to the original question. Does the Chernobyl accident suggest that nuclear power is too dangerous and thus not useful for mitigating climate change? Torch and Consequences focus on uncovering all of the effects of Chernobyl. In contrast, Chernobyl Forum focuses on precision and reduction of uncertainty about effects in three countries. Which approach do you think produces the scientific information you need to evaluate nuclear power as a possible solution to climate change? How important is the number of cancer deaths in making a decision? What else do you need to know? The written version of this talk has more details and references for more information. Have a great time discussing these issues with your friends, and thank you for listening.